on to our next panel, which is the final panel of the Global Energy Forum, with the exception that we have a whole another program tomorrow, but I'll get to that later. This panel is called Choosing Wisely, How the Biden Administration Can Build a Better Coalition on International Energy and Climate Policy in a Post-COVID World. We've got great panelists, Andrea Clabough, who's an associate at Goldwyn Global Strategies and newly minted non-resident senior fellow at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. We have Alain Ebobissé, the Chief Executive Officer of Africa 50, joining us for the second time during the Global Energy Forum. We have David Goldwyn, who is non-resident senior fellow at the Global Energy Center, chairman of our Energy Advisory Group, former special envoy and coordinator for international affairs, U.S. Department of State. The list goes on and on. And then finally, Michael Liebreich, the chairman and CEO of Liebreich Associates. So really, really phenomenal group. And Michael, you'll know, was the founder of New Energy Finance. So has a wonderful track record and perspective to bring to this conversation. This panel is, what we're using this panel to launch David and Andrea's new paper called Choosing Wisely, et cetera, the long title. And David and Andrea are going to talk about that paper first, give some context for the paper before we go into the panel discussion. So David, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Randy. And it's really an honor to present this with my excellent colleague, Andrea, and with Michael and Alain as well. As President Biden, feels good to say that, President Biden takes office, he does so with really high expectations about what he's going to be able to accomplish on energy and climate. And he's going to face challenges in the United States because he has pretty thin majorities in both houses. And he's going to face challenges abroad because we're living in this post-COVID world with severe economic dislocation. So we thought it would be helpful to pick 4 particular areas where we think President Biden can build a broader coalition and be more effective in accomplishing his energy and climate goals. And the challenge as we see it is not in getting countries to adopt higher climate ambitions, because that's easy to say what you're going to do in 2050. It's adopting the policy instruments now that are going to actually drive that change, which is much more politically challenging. And so, so we go through a few of these choices. Andrea is going to talk about the context that the president's operating in, and then I'm going to give a few of our recommendations. So let me pass to Andrea.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, for that really great introduction. And as we look forward into the Biden administration and what may be coming next, I want to take just a moment to look back a little bit, specifically to mine and David's election-focused issue briefs last year, the first of which was actually presented at this forum in Abu Dhabi. In both of those, we concluded that the post-election reality for the U.S. energy system would be defined by volatility, regardless of who actually won the election. We didn't know at the time that volatility was in fact the guiding theme for 2020. But for Biden, now that he has actually won, governing based on the historically robust principles that he articulated throughout the campaign on climate and energy will be much easier said than done, even though he has full control of the government. As David mentioned, there are some very hard realities, both on the domestic and the international political front, that will shape his overall approach to guide governance on climate change, and particularly the international climate strategy. So I want to take a minute to talk about the domestic scene and what the Biden team is looking at. They ran a very focused, very disciplined campaign, which put rebuilding the blue wall, so to speak, and reinforcing the Democratic Party's diverse big tent coalition at its center, in particular with appeals to the Midwestern and Rust Belt states, some of which had gone for Trump in 2016. Looking at the election results, one might be inclined to think that the Biden team did in fact get a very comprehensive victory. They control both chambers of Congress and of course gained the White House. But in reality, recent weeks have shown that the political situation at home is quite a bit more complicated. The Democratic majorities in the Senate and the House are by razor-thin margins, and both of them may be in jeopardy in 2022 for the first midterm elections. Tragically, COVID-19, of course, continues to rage throughout the country with harrowing levels of casualties. And as a result, the US economy is very much stagnant at the moment, with many families struggling just to get by. And of course, we all saw the recent terrorist insurrection at Capitol Hill a couple of weeks ago, as well as efforts by over 100 Republican congressmen to overturn the US election results. Taking all that together, there is very deep fragmentation and political polarization throughout the country. So what does that mean for the domestic climate agenda? Well, the Biden team really knows that it only has 2 years to run full court on its policy agenda. And there's going to be a lot to do both legislatively and federally. For example, we would expect to see the use of congressional review authority to speed along the work of re-regulating in the post-Trump era. But the Hill is going to have many priorities. Healthcare is a very important one, voting rights, immigration reform, possibly tax reform. So that's going to be a lot to do. And any major piece of legislation in Congress, such as an infrastructure bill with a significant climate element, must enjoy both unified Democratic support and ideally Republican support as well if it needs to pass with 60 votes. Even a bill passed through the budget reconciliation process needing only 51 votes is going to be challenging potentially to keep the Democratic caucus all together. And on top of all of this, the Biden administration has to look ahead to those midterms, and they have to think about their purple state senators and representatives and what those congressmen are going to run on. Some of them may come from oil and gas producing states. Some may represent constituencies which are neutral or maybe skeptical towards legislation targeting major emissions reductions or, for example, a clean electricity standard. Moving on to the international scene, unfortunately, this is no less complicated. The Build Back Better plan sought to assert the United States as a reinvigorated global leader in the fight against climate change, specifically with US technology, manufacturing, and especially US workers at the front of the charge. The Biden team has shown in its initial appointments that it is very serious about that mission, specifically the appointments of John Kerry and Gina McCarthy to lead the international and domestic climate portfolios, respectively. But that said, US allies overseas are still somewhat skeptical. They may have their own views of what an energy transition means, and in particular, what it might mean for their own governments. The European Union, as we know, has made rapid strides towards the regulatory and policy framework favoring a transition to a net zero energy system by 2050. And they are also considering pursuing a new border carbon adjustment. They may be very interested to see what the Biden administration will bring to the table at Glasgow, specifically how credible the new US nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement is actually going to be. In East Asia, South Korea, Japan, and China have all adopted new net zero targets, but they may see the role of fossil fuels in their own transitions, particularly the role of natural gas, quite differently from the European Union and perhaps some in the United States and within the Biden administration. And then finally, developing regions throughout Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia have seen tremendous economic and social dislocation as a consequence of the pandemic. Even before COVID, but particularly now, these countries may have very significant questions about what the energy transition means for their economic development, for jobs, and for their energy security, even as many of these countries are at very high risk from the impacts of rapidly accelerating climate change. So in short, there are many question marks on if and how the Biden team can assert the US as a leader that envisions both at home, but also how it asserts that leadership overseas within a new international climate strategy. And to delve into that a bit more, I will hand it back over to David.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Appreciate that. So as Andrea points out, the Biden team is going to have their hands full, both domestically and internationally. And on the international front, I think in a post-COVID world, we are seeing that in both the OECD countries, but also in the developing world, affordability, energy access, self-reliance, economic development, air quality are equal and sometimes higher drivers than dealing with the climate crisis itself, as obviously urgent as that crisis is. I think we also have to appreciate the very high level of political sensitivity that comes with actually implementing change. And it was not that long ago we saw the yellow vests in Paris, we saw constitutional change forced in Chile. A few years ago, we saw a change of government in Bulgaria over what are relatively modest increases in energy prices. So the political courage of governments really is going to be questioned for policy instruments that are going to force prices higher. Even in Japan and Korea, the talk is who's going to pay the energy transition premium. So I think there's a lot of hope among countries that innovation and technology will solve this problem. And that might be the case 2030 to 2040. But from 2020 to 2030, people have to take steps and we have to get a down payment on moving ahead. And so, as I say, it's not enough to admire the problem, you have to have some solutions. So we have a set of recommendations that we're coming up with. And if you want to put up the slide, I can take you through them. The first really is, it's really a word for the Biden administration on how you approach this internationally. And that is really having perhaps a much more flexible and inclusive climate strategy than might have been required if we were not dealing in a COVID world. The reality is regions differ enormously in what their pathway will be. In the OECD world, renewables are there, they have storage, they have the ability to, to finance change. It's going to be very different than in Africa or in India, or frankly, even in Japan and Korea. The prospects for, for the scale of renewables in a country like Japan, which is pretty densely populated, is going to be different than it is in countries which have much larger area. Also, we have a common but differentiated responsibilities. The economic burden forced on the developing world will be different. And so they're going to need a flexible approach. And we really have 3 recommendations for how they do this. The first is really to be helpful in much more creative ways. The problem in many countries is framework. It's whether there are price subsidies, it's whether there is an investable framework in the country, it's questions of grid codes and tariffs. And so technical assistance and capacity building in the nuts and bolts of creating a power purchase agreement, having an offshore wind framework is going to be really important. So if we want countries to make change, we have to help them. That's both a bilateral and a multilateral challenge. The second is on the multilateral development banks and relief funds. We're going to have to come up with help for countries to finance this transition because public money will be scarce and it's probably gone to health as it should, but it means the money available for transmission and distribution or for relieving subsidies is much more scarce. So we're probably talking about at the IMF level, significant debt relief for countries, not conditioned, but probably encouraging that they pursue change in a sustainable way, but also financing for things like transmission and distribution, which they're not going to have the money to cover. So we're going to need that on a big scale. And the Green Climate Fund, even if the US funds it, is just not big enough. We're talking about a lot more money. And a third is really to accept the different pathways for reaching these nationally determined commitments. And there, I think a technology neutral approach will help. The reality is that gas will be important for a lot of countries as an enabler of renewables. And so having multilateral development banks being unwilling to finance gas infrastructure in Africa may be counterproductive to the spread of renewables. So a little bit more technology agnostic process would be better. The second category is relationships with hydrocarbon producers. And there, I think the issue is really this, that while the Gulf countries are starting to diversify and the UAE in particular is making tremendous strides, for Guyana, Iraq, Nigeria, Venezuela, it's a very different story. The time scale is dramatically different, and these governments are not in a position to forego revenues. So they're, I think they're not only being more understanding, but we have to have a different approach to what we do. So one way, I think, is to really try and provide assistance to these countries in being much more low emissions producers than they are right now. An enormous amount of flaring goes on, and that can capture value for them in a number of ways. And the second, I think, is for the US to model at home, both methane regulation and reducing venting and flaring, so we don't seem hypocritical to other countries, but we also model what a well-regulated, low-carbon, low-emissions industry looks like. The third area is really a role for natural gas. And here, I think it's a very contentious issue in the United States and worldwide. There are people who believe that you can jump right from fossil fuels to renewables, with nothing in between. And it's just unrealistic in so many places, especially in the developing world. There's also a reality. 2/3 of the US emissions reductions came from coal gas substitution. Japan, Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, they're all counting on this for their emissions reductions, true, but their policy frameworks are market-based. There's not really a carbon tax or a forcing event. Gas is too expensive, you get more coal. So the United States has to realize that it transformed the global gas market and provided energy security by providing low-cost energy and making the market more competitive, and it needs to continue to do that. So we think there are 2 ways to reconcile this with higher climate ambitions. In the US, we talk about a methane star program, which is while regulation is going on, it might be a way that companies that want to certify that they have reduced their emissions below an acceptable level will get a validation from the Environmental Protection Agency. They get a methane star And that will be something they could use to market their gas to Europe, and maybe even to get infrastructure permitted if, if their reductions are low enough. And if you're not a low emissions producer, you don't get that star, and good luck selling your gas overseas. The second thing I think is that the US just needs to acknowledge, and John Kerry and others need to acknowledge, this role for gas in the energy transition, where it is helping to substitute for higher emissions fuel stocks, or where it's enabling gas, and affirming the reliability of US LNG exports to facilitate that particular goal will be really important, because we've heard questions about whether it's going to continue all over the place. So I think it's important. That's going to take some political courage on the US part. The last area, and I'm going to run to the end of my time, I think I can just reference the slide, is this access to critical technologies. And there's really two lessons here. One, as we heard in the previous panel, was we need to have a much better multilateral approach to assuring the supply and the value chain for critical materials. And the second is, when it comes to energy technology, there's a strong Buy American, Build American approach to the Biden Build Back Better plan, but we need to have, free trade in energy services. We need to not be nationalistic when it comes to sharing technology and collaboration. And I think we may be pushing on an open door there, but that's going to be really important. So we share the wealth and don't hoard it. I think the phrase that Andrea came up with is America leads rather than America first. And that's really how we have to approach innovation. So in sum, we think there is a way to build this coalition. We think it's hard, but we think with some flexibility and some humility and respect for the different pathways of other countries, we can get there, and we can get there quickly.
David, Andrea, thank you so much for that overview. Just for everyone's awareness, you can read this paper at the Atlantic Council website. I hope you do. It's also available in the app for the Global Energy Forum, so you can get it there. We're going to go to questions now. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please ask them through the app, and we will get to as many of them as we can. I want to turn to Alain for the first question. And Alain, there will be a big push for countries to raise ambition in anticipation of the next COP in Glasgow. And just in our previous panel, we had the Pakistani energy advisor, and the Pakistanis have made a big commitment to no new coal, for instance, and they're trying to get 30% of their vehicles be electric by 2030. So you're seeing this big push across the world. But what are the prospects for raising these ambitions in Africa? And how do you think nations will want to balance a wide range of economic, social, humanitarian drivers alongside their climate ambitions?
Well, thank you, Randy, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to contribute to this very critical discussion, really. But first, I'd like to say that at Africa 50, we very much welcome the renewed focus on climate change of the Biden administration, really. These commitments, along with active relations with the continent, will have positive repercussions for Africa and help build on the existing programs that are in place. For those in the audience who do not know Africa 50, I think I should present us quickly. We're a Pan-African organization with a goal to contribute to the continent's inclusive growth through private and PPP investment in infrastructure. We have 28 African countries as shareholders, as well as the African Development Bank and 2 African central banks. But also I should mention that we have close ties already with the US administration, having built strategic alliances with a number of US entities such as the Millennium Challenge Corporation, USAID, Power Africa Initiative. These partnerships focus on mobilizing private capital and technical expertise to support bankable infrastructure projects in Africa, mainly in the power sector, but not exclusively. Now, when it comes to climate change, first of all, I'd like to make it very clear that African nations are committed to addressing climate change. Many African countries, I think the number is 49 out of 54, have ratified the commitment to the Paris Agreement. And we do boast an impressive array of renewable energy projects. Just to give a few examples, because I think it's important to see that stuff are happening on the ground. There is the 1.5 gigawatt Bemban solar project in Egypt. I think it's the largest in the world, which is currently in operation, which Africa 50 is actually one of the investors in. You have in Kenya a number of projects, including the 310 megawatt Lake Turkana wind project and geothermal project, 280 megawatt Olkaria. Morocco has 580 megawatt Noor solar power plant. And South Africa, you have over 4,000 megawatts of renewable energy project in operation. Now, even smaller countries, such as Senegal in Africa, are committing serious resources to green energy. Senegal has over 22% of its energy mix coming from renewables projects. And most of those projects, if not all, they're funded by the private sector. So renewable energy already accounts for a lot in Africa. Certainly, 3/4 of new generation capacity comes from renewable, but we believe that it should continue to grow significantly, especially when we have some of the large hydro projects and which are currently under development or under construction come online. But I also want to highlight a massive initiative called Desert to Power, which is sponsored by the African Development Bank with the support of Africa 50, with a target to build about 10 gigawatts of solar power in the Sahel region and deliver power to a number of people. So according to the International Energy Agency, under the best case scenario, solar energy should become the largest electricity source in Africa in terms of installed capacity, and the second largest in terms of power generation by 2040. So we are serious about doing renewables. Now, while we should continue to demonstrate this commitment to implementing climate-friendly policies, the continent also has huge and urgent, I would say, development needs, which require substantial energy, especially baseload power, to be fulfilled. We need that energy. We need that very quickly. This is why a key goal for Africa should be to have the appropriate energy mix that balances climate considerations, but also development goal. And I think it would be great, and we call for that support for the Biden administration to support this approach, especially as the continent advocate for this balanced approach in the context of COP26. We believe that a key focus should be on increased use of natural gas alongside renewables, but also including hydropower and other sources of renewable energy. Africa is well endowed with these sources, and the environmental footprint is far lower than of the alternative sources that we are using now. Oil, there's quite a bit of power, oil-based power plant today, and coal. And so we should strive to push for more natural gas. Natural gas can serve as a critical bridge fuel, supporting intermittent renewable power, but also as input for industries, building, transportation. We also want to use natural gas. I believe my internet is a bit unstable. Hopefully you can hear me still.
Yes, yes.
Okay, fantastic. So we also want to use natural gas to reduce the use of wood, charcoals, and cooking fuels, because these things have huge impact on health. And we want to use natural gas, and it's very, very important to retrofit existing plants which are burning very polluting fuels. We want to do that. So natural gas should be part of the solution. As I mentioned earlier, we are also very committed to continuing to push for renewables. So we have a lot of solar and wind, hydropower, geothermal, and we should be continuing to develop those power plants. At Africa 50, the company that I'm leading, we have adopted this balanced approach, and we have funded a number of solar projects, but also a number of natural gas projects. I don't want to give the list of those, but this is what we are doing. We're doing all of the above approach. And I think this is very important to us, especially in the context of a pandemic where the needs are so urgent and huge.
Alain, thank you. Thank you so much. You mentioned the clean cooking fuel, and I think that's so important. Sunita Narain from the Center for Science and Environment in India was on an earlier panel and on energy and environmental justice, and she raised that. And she's written about that recently for a publication that the Atlantic Council launched on Tuesday called The Global Energy Agenda. It's a really important issue, and one that really raises all these questions about energy access and energy and environmental justice in a very complicated way. It's not a simple question to answer. We did have a question from the audience. It's a great follow-up for you, which is specifically how as sort of a representative of a number of countries in Africa, how do you see African countries cooperating with the Biden administration on energy access and energy transition? What messages might you want to send to the Biden administration about how you want to work with them?
Well, I mean, a similar message, which is to say that, first of all, we are very committed in Africa at finding ways to significantly increase energy access, because the electrification rate today in Africa is too low. It's less than 50% for Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, in Northern Africa, I think significant progress have been made. But what we need is really massive investment in the energy value chain. Not only generation, we need that, but also transmission and distribution. So we need massive investment. There's no solution without that. Of course, we also need to figure out ways to create efficiencies, but we need massive investment. And government resources are limited. So in Africa, we have to do our part to try to create enabling environments which are conducive to attract private investment, that's for sure. But we also would benefit from support from the Biden administration, especially to create blended finance facilities and create a bit more, room to help, fast track the adoption of renewable technologies. So that's the kind of support that we want. For example, we need also advocacy at the level of MDBs to make sure that MDBs will be able to support gas project, for example, without a lot of reservation. Of course, we can have principles that those projects should meet for the support to be done. But again, I think that we have a lot of domestic gas in Africa. We need to figure out a way to use that domestic gas, not only for industrialization purposes, which we need, but also to help with the access. And then finally, there are other models like decentralized power, which mostly use renewable technologies to, again, help with the access agenda. So a number of ways that we can work with the Biden administration to support, to help us fast track, speed up what we are trying to do already. Okay, we define the plans, we only need the support, but it's not about people telling us what to do, because we have to define what actually works for us.
Wonderful. We're going to clip that and we're going to send it to the folks who are going into the Biden administration so they know what you want, so we can get the conversation started sooner. Let's pivot to Michael for a second here. I want to talk about COVID-19 and how you think that has impacted the energy system, but really the advancement of renewables and what opportunities we have, or what challenges we face in deploying a cleaner energy system because of COVID-19.
Randy, thank you very much. That's a great question. Let me first say, it's a little bit difficult to commentate on COVID-19 in a dispassionate way as though it's a sort of a historical event. It's not, it's ongoing. We hope that we're going to exit it through the vaccines that now are rolling out and appear to work. But, so we can talk about coming out of COVID-19. I just think we should also recall that we're not out yet, and there's many people still suffering. One of the things, though, that we already see is that the impact of COVID-19 is very different economically and on the energy system than the impact of the great financial crisis, the last big global recession, which was a decade ago. And during the great financial crisis, what we saw was that clean energy, not just renewables, but right across the spectrum, was seen as the risky thing at that time. It was the more expensive thing. It was the high tech, the complicated. And what happened was the global economy retreated from clean energy and sort of retrenched around fossil fuels, what they knew, what they trusted, what was lower cost, and so on. The big difference with the COVID crisis is that the risky stuff is the fossil fuel stuff. So as we saw, for instance, the electricity demand drop briefly, what we saw was it was the coal-fired power stations that were pushed off the system and in many cases mothballed. In terms of investment, what we've seen, we've just had a record year for investment in clean energy and all of the technologies that go towards net zero in transportation as well. And they have preferentially done well whilst fossil investment and activity has suffered. And electric cars, we've just seen the most extraordinary uptick in the uptake of electric cars in Europe. It's certainly going to be followed in other parts of the world during the COVID crisis. So I think that, first of all, just the fundamental economics are now so different that it's no longer a question of, well, did COVID put this on ice? There is a theme around, well, does COVID make us want to prioritize our own countries? Does it make us more distrustful of international supply chains and so on? And you could probably argue that, but I think that that effect is going to be swamped many times over by the return of the US to the international fold, hopefully in a leadership position, although that's probably what we're here today talking about, is to what extent that is going to be a rapid resumption of leadership or just a kind of rejoining of the international world, the international community.
I mean, I want to follow up on your first point about that you've seen in COVID-19 that the safe investments are the clean ones. What does that mean for the developing world? You know, there's the conversation we've had so far suggests that perhaps, you know, thinking about just renewables is not the right way forward for the developing world. But if they are actually the cheapest technology, or they're the safest investment right now, doesn't that suggest that there's maybe a better opportunity for clean energy in the developing world, and that might actually start becoming the obvious choice with of course the technological issues that we have to manage with intermittency, et cetera?
Look, I think it's a very nuanced question. And I don't think that I can't sit here and say renewables are so cheap, that's all we should do. And that's all the developing world should do. And everybody else is just wrong. And that it's just nice and clean. It's not. It's very complicated. This is a very nuanced report that David and Andrea have been talking through. And I think that's it's very important to be nuanced. But what we see, I do think that the economics of the clean solutions, not just renewables, but also around electrification of transportation, things are moving just faster, I think, than I have to do this. David kindly invited me onto this. I have to do this without saying, bad things about his worldview. But the economics are just changing so fast. I mean, when you have wind and solar at $15 per megawatt hour, compared to, 50, 60, 70, 80 for coal and natural gas, then the intermittency issue doesn't go away, but it becomes much less critical because you simply, worst comes to the worst, you can simply overinvest. You can have overcapacity because, if your starting point is $15 a megawatt hour, then, you've got a lot of wiggle room there. You've got a lot of budget to pay for batteries. You've got a lot of budget to pay for demand response, to pay for interconnections, and so on. So there's definitely a big piece, and Alain talked about it, that Africa is moving ahead fast, where the renewables are so cheap and can be integrated. The assumption that will only get you a little bit of the way, and then really the kind of the bulk, still has to be dispatchable, has to be natural gas. For instance, natural gas for cooking, really, in rural Africa, natural gas, where there's no pipelines, no infrastructure in place, that should be LPG if you really want to get people cooking with modern solutions quickly. So that I think that these kind of, this thinking that renewables and clean solutions are sort of still more expensive and they're still marginal, it's the opposite. They are the heart of the energy system of the future. And then you want to do the other things only when you really, really can't do them with a clean solution. And what I've seen, and I've worked Sustainable Energy for All, I noticed there was a speaker on the last panel, but I've also looked at countries in Africa. I've looked at countries like Turkey. I've looked at the UK, at parts of the developed world. You hear this thing saying, the only way to do this is renewables, but you need dispatchable, you need this, you need that, and so on. Every time you push on it, you find a creative way that doesn't cost more and that is, that is going to dramatically increase, maybe not get to 100% clean energy, 100% clean transport, but from where we are today, most of the incremental capacity that can be added, and in fact, as Alain explained, the incremental capacity that is being added is clean. And natural gas, just to close my response, intermittency, natural gas peakers are now more expensive than batteries in large parts of the world. So this assumption that if you have intermittency, the only way to deal with it is natural gas, that's simply falling away, and it's falling away at a rate of speed. And so if I add one more, I said that was going to be my final point. I've got one more point. It's all about finance. These solutions are capital intensive. They're all about investing up front, whether it's generating capacity, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's electric vehicles. It's all about capital investment. And that is where I think this report has got such important things to say about the US using all the levers that it has at its disposal to help the developing world reduce the cost of capital for these solutions, because that is what will enable them to beat the conventional energy route, which would be merely replicating the mistakes that, or the technologies that we've used, that we built historically in the developed world.
Michael, thank you. And we have this rule when I moderate that if you say someone's name, they get a chance to respond, like in the Democratic debates. And so David, Andrea, Michael did mention the report and said there was maybe some questions about your worldview. He said it very nicely. So I'd love to hear your response to Michael's very vigorous argument that there really is, the renewable future is really where we're going to see the most growth, the most incremental gains in new capacity.
Great. Well, thanks for that. That's why I'd love to be on a panel with Michael. He keeps me honest, and he knows so much about this subject. But it always makes for a more enlivened debate. I mean, broadly speaking, I don't disagree. The renewables are cheaper and they're moving incredibly rapidly. The issue with storage is a little bit different because the cost of storage is coming down, but we don't have months-long storage now. So California, New England, they have significant periods when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and natural gas has come in to prevent blackouts. You need that for political stability, for political consensus for the transition. So I think that's certainly the case in the United States, but it's also the case in other places. So it's not either or, it's both and. But I think there are still enormous places where you need gas to do it. The other thing I would say is, it's the political reality we're dealing with. And look at Japan and Korea, where they've got these existing infrastructure like coal plants. If they want to make hydrogen and use ammonia to blend with coal and get a few years out of it, the goal is zero emissions, not zero hydrocarbons. And that's where I'm just saying we need to be flexible, whether that's the most cost-effective way, whether you do it ab initio if you were building an energy system, absolutely not, it'd be crazy. But the political reality is if you want to get votes for policy instruments now to reduce emissions, and we don't have a carbon tax here in the US, you're going to have to be flexible about doing that and acknowledge, where gas plays a role in storage and things like that.
Andrea, do you want to say anything? And Alain's got something.
Sure.
Alain, let me come back to you after Andrea, because I have a question that directly follows up from what David said from the audience. So Andrea first.
Sure, and I'll just be very brief. So I would roundly agree with everything David mentioned just now. And of course, second, that Michael made some really excellent comments and raises some really, really fantastic points. I would say that one of the driving themes of our analysis in our paper is that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach in every circumstance. And we'll absolutely agree that we are seeing fantastic innovation and fantastic developments around cheapening renewable energy sources and new types of renewables being brought to market all the time. A big question is, where are they that cheap, and what time of the year, what time of the day are they that cheap? Is that necessarily the story in Latin America and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe, for example? So that story may be a little bit different. And I think that that's why in our analysis, we're just very careful about saying that it's got to be one thing or the other, as David was saying, that you just have to be very, very sensitive to what the actual geographic, climatic, political, social realities are in these very different circumstances. And that it may not always be that one thing. You just have to be very mindful of where some of those challenges going just straight towards renewables might be a little bit greater than others, and being realistic about that.
Andrea, thank you. Okay, the question from the audience is from our friend Halima Croft, who wants both David and Andrea to delve deeper into the politics of gas in the United States. Both, as David, as you mentioned, you sort of, if you're thinking about Pennsylvania, if you want to get votes, you can't be too against gas. But on the other hand, I've heard stories from inside the Senate that a number of potential or nominees now for the cabinet are, quote, afraid of Bernie Sanders. And so there's the opposite feeling about gas that, David, you alluded to. How does Biden navigate that? Can't be against gas, can't be too pro-gas. What does Biden do, and how does John Kerry think about that as an international climate negotiator?
Well, let me start, and then Andrea may add on. I mean, domestically, the problem in the United States with gas, the number one problem, is the amount of associated gas which is flared coming from oil production. The numbers in Texas are ridiculous and embarrassing for the industry. North Dakota, has significant issues as well. So getting control of these emissions and leakage in the midstream and in city gas systems is number one. So I think you're seeing a move by API and the Chamber of Commerce in the U.S. to suddenly embrace methane regulation. So number one, get control of those emissions. If you get control of those emissions, and then the question is there an appropriate role for gas and the rest of the energy system? Because when you have primary gas production, they're not flaring it; they're capturing all those hydrocarbons for consumption. Then you can be supportive of gas, but not supportive of emissions of gas. And I think that's how you thread the needle. But the reality is, if typically the party in power loses the House in midterm elections, and Nancy Pelosi is a very thin majority. So production in Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Pennsylvania, a number of other states, they're going to have to be favorable to gas. I think that's how you do it. You do regulation first. And on the international front, I don't think there's any reason to pick a fight with the gas export industry if that industry is largely providing lower gas, which is enabling other countries to reduce it. I think that's acknowledging the reality that it has. And frankly, the market, as we've seen from Engie in France, is dealing with this issue because Europe may not want gas unless it's low emissions. And so talk about a market signal. It's in everybody's interest to be able to take the emissions and make US gas production, transportation, liquefaction, and export as low carbon as possible so the U.S. to compete. I think that's a sweet spot, and I think that's how you thread the needle.
Andrea, any thoughts?
Yeah, and I would just kind of add to that, and David alluded to this briefly, and Alain brought this up also. There is very strong interest among U.S. allies and partners that the Biden team has said they want to reassure and reassert the U.S. commitment to, particularly those allies in East Asia. Those governments, South Korea, Japan, are themselves banking on having a flexible, commercialized global natural gas market to be able to achieve some of these transition goals. So there's a great deal of interest in the U.S. being supportive and a component of that in a very constructive way. So if you're thinking about kind of the broader picture, that would be something very important to keep in mind as we're thinking about the value of the U.S. alliance system as it also pertains to the energy and climate goals.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think that one of the things that we're starting to pull out here is that while the resource endowments, the sort of climate plans vary by geography, what you can accomplish with renewables vary by geography, but the politics also vary by geography. So in some states, you really do need to be pro-gas. In some states, you really can't be. In the United States, I'm talking about. And so these complications make it hard to have a very unified strategy, which makes accomplishing any of this a challenge. Alain, you wanted to raise your hand, and then we have a question from the audience for you.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say something quick here about this gas. All we are asking for is basically we all agree we have to get to the target, to the net zero as quickly as possible. We are asking for flexibility, which is based on the local conditions. For example, Michael, you're right. The cost of financing is a big driver in making those renewable, the adoption of renewable technologies even faster. Now, we can sit here and try to advocate and trying to wait for blended finance, for concessional financing to be provided. And it will take years because the typical countries which are providing those concessions, they also have their own budget constraints. Or we can decide that we have to serve our folks and serve the huge development needs the best way we can, which what we are doing today. We are doing a lot of renewable whenever possible. And then we're using natural gas, for example, as transition. We are all saying it is transition. We're gonna get to the end goal. But how do we get there? And that's what we're asking for flexibility, at least a reasonable flexibility in pursuing that goal.
Michael, as same rule applies. He said your name. Do you have any response?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a big, what's happening here is essentially a sort of a rehearsal of all the arguments why natural gas is a bridge fuel, and it's almost like, sort of 2015, is calling and wants its concept back, because blended finance, as an example, I'm responding directly to Alain's point about blended finance. In Argentina, when the Macri government came in and inherited an international situation, having, the previous government had been nationalizing assets. Within 2 years, they had brought in $7 billion of blended finance. The minister responsible for that now runs an organization called Green Map, which is taking those techniques and coaching countries on how to deploy them. And so this idea that, countries are unbankable and remain unbankable, we know how to do this stuff. And, in terms of the responding to the part about, you can't do your renewables, can't do this, can't handle intermittency. Basically, the only thing you can't do with a deeply renewable system is get through those 2 or 3 weeks when there's no wind. Anything that is a daily variance, a couple of days, that has just gone away as a problem. When I say gone away, it's gone away in the developed world with sophisticated engineering, with highly trained, highly capable transmission grid operators and so on. California, the blackouts were not caused purely by the volume of renewables. They were caused by a poor regulatory structure that didn't allow the system to respond, that didn't prepare the responses of the system. One of the things that the US and the Biden administration should be doing, one I've mentioned is lowering the cost of capital, but the other is helping countries in the developing world to integrate more of this super low cost renewables. It can be done. It's being done. Germany, 50%, UK, 35, 40%, Texas, California, and so on. It can be done, but the skills need to be transferred, the technologies, machine learning, and so on and so on. And that should be the main thrust, helping these countries to take advantage of their resources rather than pushing American gas, which is what this sort of rather sounds like it's about.
David?
I could just jump in with a two-finger. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the gas part of this report, but what Michael just said is extremely important, and it's one of our core recommendations. The help the countries need to introduce large-scale renewables and to attract investment is significantly technical in a lot of places. It's having a legal framework. It's having prices. You can't sell efficiency if the price of electricity is below the cost of production. Why would you buy a more efficient light bulb? So getting prices right, targeting subsidies, having grid codes, integrating, having a kind of power purchase agreement that someone can invest in, which looks like something they have invested in before. I mean, these are the nuts and bolts, of facilitating finance and growing energy. And we think that's where the US needs to scale up bilaterally and multilaterally to make this happen, because that's how countries will get this done. So didn't want that to get lost in all the talk about gas.
Let's make a pledge. We're done with the gas conversation with the remaining 9 minutes in this panel. If everybody's making pledges, we're making that pledge, no more gas. But I do think that's really important to talk about, is where are the areas where you can get political consensus in the United States? So you're not going to sort of piss off one side or the other, where that allows John Kerry and the State Department, the Department of Energy, the USAID to really reach out to developing countries to help them both get energy access and meet their emissions goals. Why don't we first go to Alain? This is sort of the question that I was going to raise with you from the audience, a little modified because of I cut out the gas part, but outside of gas, what would you like to see from that suite of U.S. agencies that wants to help developing countries both develop energy access and meet climate goals?
Yeah, I think the two things that you will want to see, and the first thing, I think David and Michael also talked about it, the technical assistance to be able to speed up, to facilitate adoption of a higher percentage of renewable energy in the energy mix. I think it's important because we have to do that, but also, and I will come back to that, the financing, the investment, because you need a number of things. So for example, retrofitting the transmission grid. I mean, look, the transmission networks in many developing countries, they can support penetration rate of renewables, which is certainly not as high as we want to be. So you need to invest in that. So I would say technical assistance, but also financing. And the other thing is creating ways to facilitate private investments. Certainly in Africa or in other developing countries, we need to continue to create a neighboring environment which is conducive to that, to attracting. But maybe as a transition, another transition, maybe there will be political risk mitigation instrument that could be used to speed up the financing process, because these things are urgent. Okay, we all know what to do in the next few years, but as policymakers in many developing countries, especially post-pandemic, the needs are for yesterday. You need to do stuff reasonably quickly. So that's why I think that financing, risk mitigation instrument. Finally, the helping also in adopting new models such as distributed energy, distributed power, to make sure that not everything has to go through the grid. Stuff like that. I think this kind of support will be quite useful to help us on the continent.
Fantastic. I got a great question from the audience that I want to pose to everybody who wants to answer it. And it's a really simple one. Should the U.S. and others pay developing countries to shut down coal plants? And of course, build the power that they would need from another source. Anybody, any takers? David.
I mean, we attempted the clean development mechanism years ago, which was the idea that, developed countries could buy emissions by reducing emissions through projects in other places. And it's kind of fallen by the wayside because it didn't drive us to aggregate lower emissions. But I think as we look at, the world of offsets, a lot of the offsets are, trees are fine and there's a lot to be done there, but a lot of offsets are really hot air. So I think some concept where you can enable people to do some percentage of offset of emissions by financing the energy transition in the developing world would be really helpful. I don't have a problem with paying to shut down those coal plants in some fashion, as long as they don't get reopened under some other guise, and as long as that money is going to to create some new form of energy. But you might accomplish the same thing by retrofit, by dual fuel, by by different kinds of blending. But I'm all for it. And if you look at, just to take one more minute on this, sort of the Caribbean, which is an area highly dependent on fuel oil and kerosene, and extremely vulnerable. You could probably retrofit the whole system in the Caribbean to renewables with some sort of support for a couple of $1 billion. I think that's, easy money well spent.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we're running short on time. I have a question for our non-Americans. The U.S., of course, has had a rough 4 years, particularly on climate and energy. What would you like to see the Biden administration do domestically to show that they're serious? So not the work internationally, but what do they need to do at home to show that they're really serious about confronting the climate challenge, while also, also leading. What was Andrea's phrase? America leads, not America first. So Michael first, and then we'll go to Alain.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to answer that, and then I'm going to tack on a couple of things which have not come up yet, which I think they have domestic and international implications. The first thing is walk the walk. Walk the walk. You know, there has been 4 years of I don't want to call it volatility, but just, you know, US is now at this point in time, despite the great relief that is felt around the world at the arrival of the US back on the scene, not seen as a reliable partner. And you have to earn the right to be a reliable partner. That means you can't go and, you know, to the last question, you can't pay a developing country to shut down its coal whilst having ambivalent policy domestically. So I think, you know, walk the walk, all the things that we've talked about on fugitive emissions, cleaning the grid, just rapidly accelerating, make sure that that 2050 pledge, which I assume is going to be made, is real. A couple of other things, though. I want to promote the idea of a free trade agreement in environmental goods and services, right? Or free trade. I mean, start by getting rid of stupid trade wars that involve environmental. We need global supply chains. The reason that's international and domestic is, of course, that's another way of saying don't do an America first approach to saying, of course, this involves vast amounts of mining, vast amounts of manufacturing, and creating barriers to advance. Win the way American companies always win. Be smarter, be more innovative, and then export those technologies. Bring back the jobs to America by being better at this stuff, not by raising barriers. And then the third thing I just wanted to put in there is resilience. Think about the resilience. California got way too close to a power cut, right? And think about the resilience and exporting a new sense of what people really need is they want this transition, they want the jobs, they want the security, but they have to have a resilient system. So put that at the heart, use the word resilience. Whenever you get people pushing back about climate change, it's not about climate change, it's about resilience. It's about protecting people's lives, people's jobs, people's livelihoods, and so on, and then export that, and that will go a long way, I think.
Michael, thank you. Alain.
Well, yes, quickly, I suppose I'd same along the lines of working the work, actually, that Michael, but I won't be too tough because I'm seeking support from the U.S. administration, so I cannot say things. So how about I say that, you know, take some measures that makes people a little bit uncomfortable. You know, how about emission standards? Set them somehow to make sure that you actually show that you are serious about it, and then you'll be credible enough to go and you know, engage some of those other folks that have to take tough measures in tough political environments. So do some of this stuff domestically also.
Alain, thank you so much. I want to give the last few moments to Andrea and David to make any final remarks about the paper and your thoughts on what you had to say after this conversation. Andrea and then David.
So I would say thank you to everyone for a very illuminating and an excellent discussion. I would say that generally, I imagine that all of us agree very much more on these issues than perhaps we seem to disagree here in the panel. But I just want to thank everyone again for all those really excellent inputs.
Right, I'd say the same. It's been really an excellent conversation. I think the main message that we have in our report, and we've heard it here, is flexibility, you know, and appreciating the regional differences. And I think if we do that, we can promote renewables, we can reduce emissions, we can provide reliability and resilience, and most importantly, we can build a political consensus here in the U.S. for change and have a more effective consensus for near-term policy change at the international level. And that's what we all want.
David, Andrea, thank you so much. Alain, Michael, thank you for joining me. Remember, everybody, you can read David and Andrea's report. You can get it on the Atlantic Council website or on the app, the Global Energy Forum app. Really fantastic conversation.